Earlier when I was praying and meditating for guidance, I can only think of what Alfred always says, which is, hi, family. And tonight, we are a family. We are a big family. MauiFest 7 family is big tonight. We're here. I met people from everywhere. So speaking of family, about 8-9 months ago when we started planning MauiFest 7, my family and I, my wife Diane and my son Alex, went to California to visit a family. And one night we were having dinner with Marv and Emily and my son's godfather, John F. And after dinner I asked John, because of his commitment to AA, he knows a lot of speakers in this land. And I said, John, do you have any suggestions for us for MauiFest 7? So he took me to his car, and he opened up this briefcase, and it was about 100 CDs in there of speakers. And he pulled one, and he said, here you have it, Tami. And I looked at him and I said, just one? He said, take the CD to the committee and let them decide. So, to make a long story short, Tami is here tonight. And we've had the pleasure to spend some time with Tami and her husband, Patrick. We did some sightseeing in some beautiful areas of Maui. She got to see a banana tree for the first time. And I am honored and excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Tami P. from Chattsworth, California.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tami, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm grateful to be here tonight. I'm grateful to be anywhere tonight sober, that's for sure. You know, I want to start by thanking the convention committee, predominantly Vicki, Sherry, and Claire. And I want to thank our two hosts, Alex, Diane, and Little Alex, or Al, Diane, and Little Alex, for being, you know, greeting us at the airport and making our visit thus far, you know, just such a memorable and a beautiful experience. And, you know, it's a pretty good deal for just not killing myself anymore. So I'm really grateful to be here tonight. You know, I'm just going to get right into my story. First of all, I've never been to Maui before, so this is like a real treat for me. And, yeah. And they told me that great events would come to pass for me and countless others, and boy, they weren't kidding, were they, huh? Anyway, I had my first drink when I was 13. You know, let me just give you my AA resume really quick. My sobriety date is 4/24/93, so I'm well into my 19th year of sobriety. And that may not impress you, but I know it really impresses my mom and my family. And quite frankly, it impresses me. And not what I've done with my life, but I'm absolutely amazed what you people have done with your life, with my life. And you know, if there's new people in the room tonight, I'm going to tell you what they told me, you know, 19 years ago when I came crawling through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. After drinking away the only two things I was even remotely capable of loving up to that point in my life, my 5-year-old son and my 6-year-old daughter. And we all pay a different price for our drink. And I've spoke at quite a few of these conventions, and, you know, ultimately someone will come up and say, hey, you're going to entertain us tonight? Hey, you're going to make me laugh? And I'm going to tell you, there is nothing funny about breaking a little 5-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl's heart. I'm not a funny speaker. I don't think acute alcoholism is funny. We destroy ourselves and we destroy anyone that's remotely in contact with us. And they didn't tell me when I came in here, get a sponsor, work the steps, get a book, do this and do that. First of all, they asked me if I was even an alcoholic, and I told them I didn't know. And they went and stuck my nose in this book, Alcoholics Anonymous, and they helped me to understand what an alcoholic was. And they told me, Tami, you don't ever have to drink alcohol again if you don't want to. And even if you do want to, we of Alcoholics Anonymous can absolutely show you a way of life that you never have to drink alcohol again. I think Alcoholics Anonymous sometimes gets away from that, but that is the best promise you can give a drinking or a sober alcoholic, that you don't ever have to drink alcohol again. And they kept that promise that night, and they've kept it to me for the last almost 19 years now, and I'm truly grateful for that. I had my first drink when I was 13 years old, and I've come to understand after reading this book, Alcoholics Anonymous, that I had a strange and abnormal reaction to alcohol the very first time I ever drank it. But I didn't understand that at 13 years old because I didn't know what an alcoholic was. My dad was having a business party, and my dad had a lot of business parties. And this particular night, instead of him sending my sister and I, my sister was exactly 1 year older than I was. She was 14, I was 13. And instead of shipping us off to friends and to neighbors or to relatives, he decided that we were finally old enough and mature enough to stay and help out at this party. So about 20 minutes before the party started, I remember my sister and I had matching outfits, and we had our hair and nails done. And my mom looked beautiful, and my dad looked handsome, and the house looked beautiful, and the valet parking was downstairs. And this guy walks in, and he has a cummerbund, a bow tie, a brown skin, and a white tooth smile. And he walks straight into my dad's bar, and he starts popping these champagne bottles. And I remember at 13 years old just thinking, oh my God, I am so grown up. I mean, I've arrived, right? And he walks over, and he's at the bartender, and my sister and I prop ourselves up on the bar stools, and we're watching him, and he's popping these champagne bottles, and he has these long, elegant flute glasses, and he's tipping them sideways and pouring the champagne in these glasses, and the bubbles are going from the bottom up to the top, and the whole thing just seems so Hollywood and so romantic. And I remember my sister saying to him, what does champagne taste like? And he said, well, it's kind of sweet, it's kind of tingly, it tickles your nose. Would you like to try a sip? And she said, can I? And he said, sure. So she picked up the champagne and she sipped it, and she sputtered the whole thing out and said, oh my gosh, that's nasty, it's terrible. And you know, like any good budding alcoholic, I always try to play one-upsmanship in arenas that I can. And I certainly saw an opportunity here. And so, you know, my older sister, the one that made the grades and didn't get those potential lectures, couldn't handle this drink. So I said, can I try some? And he said, sure. And I took a whole flute of champagne, and I just downed it as quickly as I could, the whole thing. You know, and his eyes went open, and my sister's jaw dropped, and now, you know, I've got an audience. So I took both hands, and I went boom, boom, and I drank two more, you know, and I wish I could tell you that from my very first drink, I was at one in harmony with the world, and all my unresolved childhood issues came to fruition. I just remember being absolutely delighted that I could find one more thing that I could do that my sister couldn't. And more importantly, I remember slurring my words and acting silly and being angrily put into my bedroom before the party even started by that father I had so wanted to please. I was scared to death of my father, and any time I had any opportunity to try to impress him, I just remember that nervous anxiety, and yet one more time he's putting me in that bedroom with that look on his face that I had come to know so well by the age of 13. You know, the book tells us that our stories disclose in a general way up here. So, you know, to make a real long, complicated story short, I ran away from that home at age 15. I had been put in 2 foster homes prior to the age of 15 because of the illicit nature of the relationship my father had with his 2 teenage daughters. If you were a girl and you had a budding teenage body, you weren't safe to live at home with my dad. And when I was 15, my sister ran away from home when she was 16. And Child Services intervened one more time through my school, and my dad had to move out until there was a court date, and I was asked to go into a foster home until that court date. And it was the first time I faced going into a foster home without my sister, and I was really scared and I didn't want to go. So at 15 years old, I ran away from home, and I found my 16-year-old sister, and I moved in with her, and she and I are sharing this one-bedroom, you know, little room that she was renting, and she was still in high school, and I dropped out of high school, and I became a 15-year-old runaway. And I lived with my sister maybe for about 3 months, and that was just like insane. We had no parents, and I'm not even going to school, and she's trying to go to school and work after school to pay the rent. And so eventually I moved out from her, and I became a 15-year-old runaway. And again, you know, I don't need to go into graphic detail, but I did what 15-year-old runaway girls do in order to survive. I was young, I was fun, I was cute, I was worldly, and I was willing to pay a price. And sadly to say, there were a whole lot of older men out there that were willing to allow a little 15-year-old girl to pay a price that no 15-year-old girl should have paid. I remember eventually I met this guy that actually just kind of felt sorry for me and gave me a place to live. He was 42 years old, and eventually, I became his live-in girlfriend, which, looking back, that was insane. But he was actually college-educated engineer, and here I am, a 15-year-old high school dropout, living with him, and we're playing house. And I remember at night we used to watch that game show Jeopardy on TV. Now, I'm a high school dropout, and he's college-educated, but I used to beat him often at this game show Jeopardy. And I was kind of a gooky little kid, I'm an English teacher today. I teach 8th grade English at a middle school out where I live in Los Angeles. And it was as sadly true back then when I came up in the 1960s and 70s as it is today. If you're a good-looking kid and you're popular, or if you're academically inclined, or if you have some athletic prowess, school is a pretty safe place for you to live in. But I look at some of my little guys and girls, and they don't have one of those three components, and they struggle just to get through a day of middle school every single day. Well, even though I had all the court dates and the craziness going on at home with my parents and the foster homes and my dad, I was a popular student at school. I was such a good athlete that they allowed me to play on practice with the boys after school on their baseball teams and their, football teams before there was co-ed sports. And I was an excellent student. And so I kind of had this double life. I was kind of scared, out of control, insecure Tami with my family, but I was athletic, academic, popular Tami by day. Well, now I'm a runaway, but I kind of brought that double life into this early adult life that I was forming. And so, I'm a 15-year-old runaway, and I'd go to tanning salons and do all this craziness, but I'd also, read all these. I was very well read. I used to read like Ayn Rand and Germinal and all these books. And so I was kind of this gooky kid, and I remember one day this 42-year-old boyfriend, and I walked into the post office, and he saw an advertisement on the wall for the GED exam. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the GED exam is a battery of 5 tests that you can take, and if you pass all 5 of those tests, it's equivalent to having a high school diploma. So he turns to me and he says, Tami, you're a pretty smart little kid. You should sign up and take that GED exam. You dropped out of high school, at least get your high school diploma. Now, this certainly wasn't a thought that generated from me, but when you're a woman and you're dependent on men, you kind of do whatever the flavor of the month suggests, so I'm like, okay. So I get the form and I fill it out, and I go off and I take the GED exam, and I took it 1 week after I turned 16 years old. And about 4 weeks after I took this exam, I received notification in the mail that I had passed the GED exam, which quite frankly doesn't say a whole lot for the exam because I never even went to high school, but I passed this test. And so now I have this high school diploma, and about 3 weeks after that, a woman out where I lived in Los Angeles called me, and she worked for a local newspaper. And the GED exam has been around since the end of World War II. However, they had just lowered the age in the state of California to take it from 18 to 16, and I was one of the first people in the 1970s to pass the GED exam at the age of 16. And she worked for a newspaper and wanted to come out and do an editorial on what someone who was 16 years old was going to do with the GED exam. So she says, can I come out and interview? And I'm like, okay. So she comes out to my apartment. Now, I'm wearing like a tube top and Daisy Duke shorts. And I think, I've got this wild blonde hair, and we've got like a fish tank and beads and a strobe light. And this girl comes out to interview me, and I'm living with this 42-year-old man. And when I first came into Alcoholics Anonymous, the old-timers used to say, Tami, you don't have a bad little message from the podium, but it's kind of hard to decipher with all your swear words and with all your cussing. Could you please clean up your language from the podiums of Alcoholics Anonymous? And I'd sit with my tube tops and my little, Daisy Duke shorts, and I'd say, yeah, what the F does that have to do with sobriety? And the old-timers used to tell me, Tami, this is a program of attraction, not distraction. And, between your language and your sexual dress and your sexual movements in our meeting, you're kind of distracting. So can you kind of dress like a lady and clean up your language? And not be so distracting in our meetings. And I'd sit with my low-cut tops and my high-cut shorts, cussing like a drunken sailor, saying, yeah, well, what the F does that have to do with sobriety? Recognize the newcomer attitude. And anyway, and when this girl came, to my apartment that day, I opened up the door, and there's this girl. She was probably just a year or two older than my daughter is today. She was about 25 years old. She had graduated college, and this was her first job as a journalist, and she was beautiful. She had no makeup on, her hair was parted on the side, she had this little business suit on, she had this like recording equipment, and she walked in, and as she walked in my apartment, I remember feeling like this low-class, uneducated, pass-around Sue, and I felt that dirtiness and that insecurity that I had always felt, and it's like she didn't notice it. And she looked at me and she said, "Tami, you just passed the GED exam and you didn't even go to high school. You must be really, really smart. Are you going to go on to community college?" And I'm like, community college, you know, I don't come from college-educated kind of folk. This isn't the kind of dialogue we have in my house. It's more like court dates and parties. So I said to her, well, what's community college? And this beautiful 25-year-old girl who didn't cuss and who spoke articulately and who was dressed becomingly met me 2 weeks later. She gave me her card, and she met me down at a community college where I lived, and she helped me sign up to go to community college at 16 years old and walked me through the registration, the admissions, and everything. And old-timers, now I know why you asked me to clean up my language and dress like a lady, because this girl was an example to me of a role model for a woman that I had not seen. And you know, inevitably in my home group, I'll sit with my husband Patrick, and there she comes, Tami Jr., wild, sexual, and cussing, you know. And I remember this girl, and I try to look her in the eye, and I try to look beyond that, because I know it's just a cover for all that other stuff. And I'm deeply indebted to her. And you know, there's a universal truth in Alcoholics Anonymous. New people in Alcoholics Anonymous, if you don't like the old timers, don't worry about it. You're never going to be one. Because, you know, our old-timers are some of the most disrespected, untapped resource in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I am deeply indebted to the ladies and gentlemen that cared more about my life than they did about my feelings. And they made me swallow some hard truths that they talk about in this book that I needed to swallow and face about myself so that I could bridge or make that bridge from drunkenness into sobriety. You know, and I sponsor women today, and in fact, I'd like to thank Allie and Julianne for coming out tonight. You know, they surprised me. I told them I was speaking in Maui, and all of a sudden, 2 of the girls I sponsored showed up here tonight, and, you know, I can't tell you how much that means to me, yeah. I want to know how come the girls I sponsor can afford to go to Hawaii on their own, but that's okay. And they're just an absolute delight. Anyway. So I start going off to community college, and you know, when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, people played a lot of one-upsmanship here from the podium as well, and I'd sit in the back of the rooms, and women would come up here and say, you know, I drank 24/7. I drank around the clock. I didn't draw a sober breath for 10 years. And I'd sit in the back of your rooms, and I'd say, well, then you know what? I am definitely not an alcoholic. Because, see, I can swear off alcohol. And when that girl showed such an interest in me and took the time to help me to go to college, I went into one of my swearing off periods. And they talk about this in the book. It says we have brief intervals of recovery. In fact, we have special skills, aptitudes, and abilities. It tells us that we can build a bright outlook not only for ourselves but for our loved ones, and then we pull the whole thing down over our head with a senseless series of sprees. So when this girl showed this interest in me, I went into my swearing off periods, and I don't know what your swearing off periods look like, but mine are always with a solemn oath that I'm never going to drink again. And I take all my bottles and I put them in a brown paper bag, and I like to throw them like high in the air and listen to them, boom, you know, crash in a dumpster like farewell alcohol, okay? And then I go into this kind of crazy thing I do. I'll take, you know, some money and I'll go buy really expensive conditioner for my hair. Now, I've been living on a diet of like bad men and alcohol, but I start conditioning my hair, and then I go to like a local health food store and I'll buy like couscous and brown rice and yogurt. Then I join the local health gym, and I'm going to now become an athletic trainer, okay? I've been puking in porcelain bowls. And so for the next 2 years, I went to Pierce College. And I took 17 units a semester. I made the dean's list all 4 semesters. I conditioned my hair, I shaved my legs, I painted my toenails, I worked out every day, I became a triathlete, and and I ate health foods, yeah, and I was nuts. And that's what I do when I swear off alcohol. You know, easy does it ain't never been a mantra of mine, okay? So I keep this up for for 4 semesters, for 2 years. And at the end of that 2 years, when I graduated from that community college, I received an award called the Chancellor's Award. And that's where a couple of department heads picked a few students that demonstrated academic excellence. And they gave me what was called the Chancellor's Award. And that award entitled me to go to any of 21 colleges in the state of California, 4-year institutions. And they were going to pay my tuition, my housing, my textbooks, and my living costs. And guess what I did, guys? Of course, I quit. Because I intuitively knew at 18 years old, now I don't understand the mental obsession of alcoholism because I don't know what an alcoholic is. But at 18 years old, I intuitively knew that there was no way that I could sustain that type of discipline for another 2 years. See, when I get married or I get a good relationship, I will, over a period of time, sabotage it so he leaves so I can say, pour me a drink. I'll bring children into the world and I will systematically do actions until I lose custody of them and then say, pour me a drink. I will get awards and scholarships to go to all kinds of colleges and then I'll systematically somehow screw all that up so I can suck my thumb and say, pour me a drink. At my home group, I hear a lot of people come in and they say, you know what, I'm afraid of failure. That's not what the book tells us. I'm afraid of success. Because if I have a modicum of success, you're going to have expectations of me. It's so much easier to be the consummate failure and have everyone have no expectations of me. And, you know, that's been a pattern, and they talk about that in this book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And, you know, if I went another 2 years to college, I'd have to condition my hair, shave my legs, paint my toenails, work out. I knew I couldn't do it. And that's the mental obsession of alcohol. I somehow will gear my life to where eventually I have no responsibilities and I can drink with impunity, and I don't care if everyone's rolling their eyes at me because that's where I'm comfortable. And that was a pattern in my life for many, many years. So I dropped out of high school and college again for the next couple of years. I do what I do best, which is bad relationships and drinking, and my drinking has escalated. Now I've picked up a DUI. But at 21 years old, I again go into another swearing off period, and I enroll at Cal State University, Northridge, and the pattern starts up again, because this time it's going to be different. So I enroll in 17 units, and I start running 10Ks, and I'm working out every day and doing that whole deal again. And I'm finding another older man to live with. That's another pattern of mine. I always find some guy to take care of me. And I'm living with this older guy going to school, and all of a sudden this guy moves into this condominium that's vacant next to us. His name was Rick. Rick was an obstetrician. He delivered babies for a living. He had just gotten a divorce, and Rick and I developed this friendship because he also runs 10Ks, and I'm at Cal State Northridge taking physiology and microbiology, which are classes that paralleled some courses he had taken in medical school. Now, the fact that I'm living with another guy is just an incidental. It always is, you know, and Rick and I work out together, and Rick and I go to lunch together, and Rick and I do homework together, and I know Rick has a crush on me. He'd been married for eons and just got out of a marriage. And but my brief intervals of recovery are, you know, becoming less and less frequent, and my falling off the wagon is becoming more and more frequent. And poor old Rick met me in one of my swearing off periods. So he thinks I'm athletic, academic, popular, Tami by day, just like I was when I was a kid, you know, and one night I remember Dennis came home and we got into tequila. And Dennis was the older man I was living with. I don't even mention his name. That's how much of an incidental he was at that point. And we got into tequila. I like to call it tequila if you're me. And we start doing shooters of tequila. And the next thing I know, we get in one of those knockdown, drag-out fights, you know, the way we know how to do. We're pulling each other's hair and taking each other's inventory and cussing each other out. And it got violent, and Rick, who lives next door, called the cops. And the cops come to my door, and Dennis goes to the door, and he gets rid of the cops, and Rick's standing behind the cops going, "Is Tami okay? Is Tami okay?" And Dennis got rid of the cops. He got rid of the boyfriend. And then Dennis and I went upstairs and did one of those all-night, you know, passionate makeups, the way we know how to do. You know, we're killing each other and talking about each other's mothers at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock after the cops leave, like, "Oh, baby, you're my soulmate. Don't ever leave me," because we're nuts. And we stayed up all night, you know, making up. And then I woke up the next morning and I did exactly what's described in this book, Alcoholics Anonymous. That after a while, a drinking alcoholic can no longer separate the true from the false. that after a while, the only life a drinking alcoholic comes to understand is their drinking life. And I thought nothing the next morning of waking up, taking a little liquid makeup, covering up the black eyes, the bruises, and the choke marks, putting a backpack on my back, and going off to Cal State University Northridge like there is nothing wrong with this picture. 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd been sitting in classes all day. I'd been beaten up the night before by my boyfriend. And ladies, let's be fair, I beat him up too, okay? We made up all night, so I hadn't had any sleep. I'd been drinking the night before, so I'm feeling, pretty lousy. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I park in the underground parking of this condominium complex that we live in, and I'm walking toward the elevator, and my jaw is tight, and my back is tense, and I'm not feeling good. And all of a sudden, I realize that if I go in that elevator, go up 3 flights of stairs, past the first door, put my key in the second door, walk in and open up the cabinet, right above the sink, there's liquid relief, and it's on its way. Now, I haven't seen the alcohol, I haven't smelled the alcohol, and I haven't tasted the alcohol, but my jaw starts to relax, and I'm walking toward the elevator, and I'm feeling good. And if you identify with that, you're probably an alcoholic. And apparently you do. Anyway, so I'm getting to that elevator now, and I just know liquid relief's coming, and all of a sudden I hear that neighbor Rick, that had called the cops on us the night before, say, "Tammy, hold the elevator." And man, I'm like pushing that closed door button because I don't want to get stuck in the elevator with the guy that called the cops. And man, his hand caught it just in time, and the doors open, and Rick walks into the elevator, and he starts asking those questions that they ask of us. And he said, "Tammy, can I ask you a question?" And prior to coming to Alcoholics Anonymous, I used a tremendous amount of cussing and brash, tough girl behavior, or a lot of inappropriate sexual behavior and humor to kind of always keep you off your footing with me, so you could never just look me in the eye and have an intimate conversation with me. So Rick asked me this question, or wants to ask me questions, so I pull out the tough girl first, because that usually keeps you at bay. And I'm like, "Yeah, what the F do you want, man?" Because I'm really tired. I've been in school all day, and I'm not feeling too hot. And he turned my shoulders toward him. So I realized the cussing thing wasn't working, so then I took his tie, and I'm like, "Ooh, this is a pretty tie, and oh my God, you smell so good." And I'm going to bring out the seductress to see if that's going to work. And I remember he just kind of held me back, and he took my chin, and he held it so I couldn't wiggle away. And he looked right down into my eyes with those beautiful brown eyes of his. And he said, "My God, Tammy, what is it about you? You seem to have so much potential, but you're so confusing to me." And for whatever reason, I got off the elevator that day, and I went to Rick's apartment, and I told Rick the cry of every drinking alcoholic. I told him about my dad, I told him about my childhood, and I told him one day I'm going to finish my education, and one day I'm going to have my own job, and one day I'll pay my own way and not live with these abusive men, and one day, and one day, and one day, because the cry of every drinking alcoholic is, I know my life appears kind of insane right now, but one day, poof, it's just going to all come together and be okay. And if you're an alcoholic in this room, you believe that too. The sad thing is we believe that for years, and that day never comes as long as we keep drinking. And I broke down that day for whatever reason, and I remember crying. Rick turned to me and he said, "Tammy," he said, "I really want to help you." He goes, "I can see you need help, and I'm so sorry to hear about all this stuff that's happened in your life, but I really care for you, and I want to help you." And I don't know why, but that made me cry, and I broke down. And for the first time in 21 years, I cried like the broken little girl. I really was, and always had been. And I remember he pulled me into him, and I remember my head was on his chest, and I could feel him breathing, and he just stroked my hair, and I remember feeling my body start to relax. And I left his apartment that day, and I know I didn't pick up a drink that night. I was exhausted, and I went to bed. But the next morning I woke up, and I felt that fear that they talk about in this book, Alcoholics Anonymous. That fear that comes in 100 different forms. That fear that guides an alcoholic's actions, an alcoholic's thoughts, and an alcoholic's behavior. And I did the only thing an alcoholic knows how to do when they feel that fear. And they don't have a God that they can pray to for strength. And they don't have friends like Allie and Julianne that they can just come down to their local AA clubhouse and talk those dumb fears through with. And I poured myself a drink. Every alcoholic has a plan. It's never a good plan, but we always have a plan. And that morning, I poured a couple fingers of vodka in a glass, and I downed it at 9 o'clock in the morning to bait that fear. And I came up with a plan. See, I had the key to Rick's condominium because I used to watch his cat and water his plants when he'd go to medical conventions. And I knew he had like this huge crush on me. And my plan was that I could not stand the fact that Rick saw that I was broken. And he saw something in me I could see in the empathy in his eyes that I couldn't even see in myself. So my plan was I was going to move out from Dennis, move all my stuff into Rick's apartment that day while he was at work. And then when he came home, I'd be his live-in girlfriend, and I'd get in between the sheets, and I'd seduce that broken little girl image he had of me out of his head between the sheets. Rick came home that afternoon, and there I was. And not only did he let me stay, but he married me 3 weeks later. And the day he married me was the day he qualified for Al-Anon. And you know, I am deeply, deeply indebted to Al-Anon, and you will not hear me say Al-Anon jokes because Al-Anon took away my greatest enabler. But God, I hated you Al-Anons while I was drinking. So anyway, that marriage produced 2 children, and I'm just going to let you know that for the next 7 years of that marriage, I proceeded to punish Rick for everything that my dad had ever done to me, and I punished him for everything that the men in the streets out there had done to me. And because Rick was pre-Al-Anon and pre a program of recovery for himself, he sadly took the butt kicking, and I darn near destroyed his soul. You know, Rick did not come up easy. His dad was a raging alcoholic. His mother needed Al-Anon and never made it. He was an air flight surgeon in the Vietnam War, and after being married to me for 7 years, and he had put himself through medical school, he was like scared of his own shadow and stuttering, and he was like a nervous wreck. And that's what I do to people when I drink alcohol. And the marriage produced 2 children, and today I have a daughter, Chelsea, that's 24, and my son, Alex, is 22. And through the grace of God, I was so physically sick when I was pregnant with both my children. I had a condition called hyperemesis where I couldn't keep any food down during pregnancy. And for the 9 months I was pregnant with my daughter, I couldn't stand the smell of coffee, I couldn't stand the smell of perfume, and I couldn't stand the smell of alcohol. And I went an entire 9 months without picking up a drink. 6 weeks after I gave birth to my daughter, my breast milk started to dry up, and I didn't know why. So I went to my OBGYN. Now, my ex-husband hates me sharing this because he's an OBGYN, and I found out I was pregnant again just 6 weeks after I'd given birth to my daughter. You're like supposed to wait. And I went another 9 months of my life not being able to stand the smell of alcohol. 4 weeks after my son was born, I was in bed in the morning and I heard them on the nursery monitor, and I went into their room. Now, I haven't had a drink in 21 months, but I opened up the door and I look, and there's this little 1-year-old girl and this newborn baby boy looking at me for something. And I am so painfully aware that I am a completely dependent human being myself, and I have nothing to give those kids. And I felt the fear that they talk about in this book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And one more time, I did the only thing an alcoholic knows how to do when they feel that fear, and I went back to the bottle. I became around-the-clock drunk within 1 month. To give you some idea of the way I drank alcohol, for the next 3 years, I woke up every morning, I'd go out of my bed, I'd go into the bathroom, and I would lock our bathroom door. I had long blonde hair, and I'm a puking drunk. That's not feminine, but there's never been a time that I've drank beverage alcohol and I didn't puke. I wish I could tell you like I vomit once in a while, but I'm the type that like shoots chunks of food, you know, like into your tie. And, you know, guys used to have to pull over on dates and open the car door so I could like puke in the curb. So I used to have to wrap my blonde hair up in this shower cap. And believe it or not, I had 2 shower caps. I had like a plastic Naugahyde one for the winter, and then I had like a lighter linen one for the summer. And then I had this old UCLA sweatshirt of my husband's that I'd cut the neck out of because the barf particles that bounced off the toilet water and got in my hair would also get on my bedclothes. Then I'd take a toothbrush with toothpaste, and I'd put toothpaste on the toothbrush, and I'd lay that down on the counter. Then I'd get this bottle of vodka that I kept under the counter in our bathroom. I'd plug my nose, I'd uncap the bottle because God forbid I smelt the fumes, and I'd start to retch and puke before it stayed down long enough to take effect. Then I'd take the toothbrush with the toothpaste and I'd brush my teeth and brush my tongue because God forbid I would taste it before it took effect. Then I would slowly release my fingers and pray that that vodka would heat up my chest and give me that goofy feeling in my head. And then I'd turn around and puke the whole thing up in the toilet every single morning. Mommy, are you done throwing up again? And if that isn't insane, I don't know what is. To give you some idea of the effect that alcohol had on me, I started drinking round the clock. Now, I'm married to a surgeon. My husband's an OB/GYN. He specialized in hysterectomies, which is surgery. I'm living in a 5-bedroom house. My husband, I was starting to get DUIs and starting to become drunk during the day and not be responsible for my children. So my pre-Al-Anon husband decides to get a full-time housekeeper to stay home and watch me to make sure I don't drink and drive. And he sends our 2- and our 3-year-old out for full-time daycare. So I don't go to school. I don't work. All my bills are being paid for. Someone else is raising my kids. Someone else is cleaning my home. And I'm just spending all day long drinking around the clock, pretty much. I mean, obviously, I'd swear off and be back at it like within a day. And to give you some idea of the effect, I remember one day in particular, he had delivered babies all night long, came home in the morning and picked up the 2 children from our housekeeper, took them off to daycare the following morning while he went and made rounds at the hospital, saw office patients all day long, picked the kids up from daycare after the day was over to bring them back home to the housekeeper, and somewhere around noon that day, I had gotten myself good and tanked and got on the 2-story roof of the house that we lived in. And he pulls into our cul-de-sac around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I had gotten myself on the roof, and he pulls in with our 2 children, and there's Mom like on the roof, wild and drunk, waving to my family. He pulls the car into the garage, and he walks out of the garage, and Chelsea's on one side of him, and Alex is on the other, and all 3 of them are looking at me on the roof, and I just walked to the edge of the roof, and I literally just jumped onto my husband. And he's spinning around, and I'm digging my nails in his head, and my 2 children are screaming. The neighbors come out. And he reached up to grab me to get me off of him, and he had that huge watch, and it knocked the side of my eye right here and gave me a huge hematoma. And I waited the next morning to sober up, and I walked into the Devonshire Police Division out where I live in Los Angeles, and I filed felony battery charges on my husband for something he didn't even do. My husband is an OB/GYN. He worked at Northridge Hospital for 18 years with an impeccable record as an OB/GYN before he married me. And those detectives walked into his office with a waiting room full of women patients that had been going to him for 18 years. And they slapped handcuffs on him in front of his patients and in front of his staff. And that was the only sober parent that Chelsea and Alex had. That's what I do when I drink alcohol, folks. I am not here to entertain you, because that's what I do when I drink alcohol. It was very shortly after Rick spent a night in jail that he met this horrible group of people called Al-Anon. And again, like I said earlier, I am deeply indebted to Al-Anon because they took away my enabler, and they gave me a husband, and they gave my children a father. But God, I hated you Al-Anons. And I'm one of those women that if you do something for yourself that in any way threatens me, I have to put it down because it's a threat to me. So I remember he started going off to these Al-Anon meetings, and I think I called them are you going to go to your Let's All Feel Sorry for Dr. Rick harem meetings, because they were predominantly women. That's what a nice person I am. He's trying to do something for himself and my children, and I have to put it down. And he starts going to these meetings, and I remember one night in particular, he'd been going for about 6 weeks. And he said, Tammy, you know what? You can go to a hell in a handbasket if you want to, but you're not going to take the kids and I with you anymore. We just can't do this anymore. And I saw something in his eyes. And I knew those Al-Anons were giving my husband the strength to stand up against the insanity of my drinking. And I remember, I felt that fear. I got in my BMW. I went down to a liquor store. I bought a huge bottle of vodka. I plugged my nose. I downed as much of it as I could. It gave me that warm feeling in my chest, that goofy feeling in my head. I puked it all up in a brown paper bag, got up on the freeway where I live in Los Angeles, and I saw a call box. And in my drunken stupor, I thought it was a phone. I don't know, this tends to run more with the women, but we love to get on the phone in a blackout. I call them phoners. And I'm looking at the call box and saying, I'm going to make a phone call. And man, I just plowed my car right into that call box. And now I'm standing in front of a woman judge 30 days later, and she's looking at my rap sheet, and now I have 2 felony DUIs. And she said, Tammy, your rich doctor husband isn't going to buy you out of this one this time. You are going to serve some time. However, I will waive 30 days of your sentence if you're willing to go into a lockdown facility. And I didn't mention this earlier to you, but by the time I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had already been in 4 lockdown units, never once for the diagnosis of alcoholism. It was always mental and emotional disorders, trauma due to childhood. From 15 to 18, I got picked up twice as a runaway. And it was always childhood, trauma, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and then from 18 to 31, I had been put in 2 more lockdown units, and never once was it for alcoholism. And then I started to collect those other diagnoses that we often collect, like bipolar disorder and all this other stuff. And so I told this lady, sure, I'll go to another lockdown unit. What's the difference? And I go in and I told those doctors what I'd been telling them since I was 15 years old and first started appearing in those places. Look, I drink because the therapists tell me that I'm self-medicating because of my childhood issues, and sometimes I overshoot the mark, and this is the results because I black out and I do strange and incredible things. And those doctors told me what they've been telling me since I was 15 years old. They told me that I am drinking to self-medicate, and if they could just give me the right medications to deal with my symptoms, I would no longer need to drink. Later, when I came through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous for a buck in a basket, those crusty old-timers said, given the way you drink and more importantly the effect that alcohol has on you, we think you may just be a garden variety alcoholic. In that lockdown unit, I told those doctors that I would wake up from a blackout, I'd go downstairs, I'd see broken glass, broken children, a broken husband, and a broken home. I'd walk right back upstairs, turn the heating blanket up to Mom, suck my thumb, and think of ways to kill myself. And 2 times I attempted it. In that lockdown unit, those doctors told me that I was clinically depressed as a result of my childhood, and the best hope for me was expensive psychotherapy and being institutionalized for episodic depressions and being treated for depression and anxiety. But the important thing that I needed to know is none of this was my fault. Later, when I came through the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, those crusty old-timers had a new name for a mother that had 2 attempts on her life without ever once thinking how it would affect those 2 children. You called it alcoholism, selfishness, self-centeredness. The world revolved around my childhood pain. Forget my kids are in their childhood. It was all about me. In that lockdown unit, I told those therapists that I used to take money out of my husband's wallet, and on my swearing off periods, I'd go down to the local gym and work out with all the men, of course. And then we go up to the pub after, and I'd buy everybody drinks on my husband's dime, always playing the big shot, always taking credit for money I didn't earn. And in that lockdown unit, those doctors told me that my taking my husband's money and buying friendship of those men was my way of buying back that love that I didn't receive when my parents shipped me out to foster homes and just let me be with whoever. And my taking my husband's money was really my way indirectly of just buying back that love I never received as a kid. Later, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous for a buck in a basket, you had a really fancy explanation for that. You called it stealing. And not only did I steal my husband's money and buy other men drinks on his dime, but as a married woman and as a mother of 2 small children, I took my husband's money and I went to those hotel rooms and I did what alcoholic women do in those hotel rooms, to my husband and to my kids and to myself. And in therapy, they told me that in those hotel rooms, I was just searching for the love that I never received from my father as a kid. And later, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, you crusty old-timers had a name for that too. You called it cheating. By the time I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, my mother and my husband had paid close to $100,000 in expensive lockdown units and therapy and all these rehabs to find out that living inside of me was this hurt, broken child and a victim of this sordid childhood. And for a buck in a basket, you old-timers said, no, baby, you're a liar, you're a cheat, you're a thief, and you're an alcoholic suffering from alcoholism. And it's the first time I heard the truth about me in 31 years. So I came into Alcoholics Anonymous and I wore low-cut tops and high-cut shorts and spent most of my time flitting with you men. And I took 5 of those 30-day chips. But I'll never forget my last drink as long as I live, because I stood at a podium like this and I took my 5th 30-day chip and I attached it on my belt buckle with my other 4 30-day chips, like this was something to parade around. And I went back in the parking lot to go talk to the AA BIM boys. Those are the guys that pick up on all the newcomer women. And that's all right, guys. We have AA bimbos too. And I'm out in the parking lot. And what I didn't tell you when I took that 5th 30-day chip is that Al-Anon had rightly convinced my husband to get those 2 small children away from a mother who had already been in 4 lockdown units, had the best doctors that money could buy, has 2 felony DUIs, and now has 5 30-day chips in Alcoholics Anonymous and refuses to get sober. And they were hard on him. They told him, Rick, you are not 50% responsible for those kids, and Tammy's 50% responsible. They said, you're 100% responsible for those children because she is incapable of making a sober decision. And if she kills those kids in that car, you're going to have to stand over that grave if you don't make a decision. And what I didn't tell you is that Al-Anon had rightly convinced my husband to get the kids away from me, and he tried to evict me, and he couldn't because I was making such a scene. So he had moved our 2 children out, and working the hours that he worked, he was raising our 2 children in a 1-bedroom hotel room. And I didn't tell you that when I took my 5th 30-day chip. And I went out in the parking lot to flirt with you men, and this mean old timer, Cowboy Nick at my home group, came out. He was the manager, and he said, kid, you have a phone call. And I walked back into the club, and I picked it up, and it was my husband, Rick, and I hadn't spoken to him or my children in 67 days. And he said, Tammy, it's Rick. Are you sober? And with the arrogance of an alcoholic, I said, yeah, Rick, I'm sober. In fact, hey, I've just taken another 30-day chip. And he said, Tammy, our son Alex turned 5, and he signed up for T-ball. And the kids miss you, Tammy. And if you're sober, I want to know if you'd like to come and watch Alex's first game today. And I got the directions, and I drove out to that Little League field. And I parked my car, and as I'm walking toward this Little League field, I look, and I see my husband raising our 2 children in a 1-bedroom hotel room. And he's got, a team uniform on, standing there with this man from Al-Anon. And my husband was the assistant coach of Alex's team. And I looked over and I saw my little son Alex, and he walked up to bat, and there was this big orange cone with a red ball on it, and he had this little batting helmet, and he had these little baseball pants and these little cleats, and he walks up and he was hitting the ball, and my son was so tiny that every time he hit the ball, his little helmet kept falling over his eyes. And all of a sudden I looked over, and there was my 6-year-old daughter, Chelsea, in a little sundress, and the women from Al-Anon were doing her hair, and she was cheering her brother on. And I felt the fear that they talk about in this book, Alcoholics Anonymous. And I realized that Al-Anon was helping my family to go on with their lives without me. And I did the only thing an alcoholic knows how to do. When they feel that fear and they don't have the courage to do something about it. And I went to the only higher power I'd ever known. And I had passed a guy when I walked up to the Little League field, and he was sitting in the back of a truck with a huge cooler of beer. And I walked up to him and I said, man, you look like you're feeling good. And he said, yeah, baby, nothing a beer wouldn't cure. You want one? 4 lockdown units, 5 30-day chips, $100,000 in psychotherapy, a broken mother, a broken husband, a broken home, broken children, broken dreams. And I said yes. And I don't know what that guy's night was like, but I came to 3 days later down by the airport, which is 45 minutes from where that Little League field was. And to this day, I still do not know how I got from that Little League field where they found my car down to this woman's house in Inglewood. And I'm all of a sudden sitting in a kitchen holding an ice bag on my face, and I'm struck sober. I guess I was in a blackout and somehow kind of came to, and apparently she had taken her trash out that morning and found me in an alley behind her house against the wall. And I had my backpack with me, and I guess I'm sitting in her kitchen and I'm holding an ice pack on the side of my face, and she's giving my husband Rick directions to come and pick me up one more time. And Rick drove down to Inglewood and he exchanged some words with this woman, and I got into the car, and he turned and he handed me a manila envelope, and he said, Tammy, he said, I've moved back into our home on this last run of yours. Your mother and I left court this morning, and we have a restraining order and full custody of the kids. And this restraining order says that you cannot come within 1,700 feet of our home, of the kids' school, or of my business, and you need to go. And he didn't say another word the whole way home. He pulled up to our home in Chattsworth, and he turned off the engine, and he didn't even pull in the driveway. And he said, Tammy, you have 5 minutes to just grab some stuff, call one of your idiotic AA bimboy boyfriends to come and pick you up, and when you find a permanent place to stay, I will send you money and I will send you things. And he didn't say another word. And I walked up the stairs of that home, and I was literally spiritually dead. I had no emotion whatsoever. And I just remember this like ringing in my ears. And I walked up the steps, and I got my gym bag, and I threw some sweats and some t-shirts and some sweatshirts in it. And as I started to walk down the stairs, I saw Rick at the bottom of the stairs, and I said, "Look, Rick, can I just say goodbye to the kids before I go?" And he said, "Tammy," he said, "your mom and I have called every morgue and hospital in the greater Los Angeles area for the past 3 days. Your children have been through hell and back." And he says, "You can look in on them, but for God's sakes, woman, don't you dare wake those kids." And I opened the door to my little 5-year-old son Alex's room that night, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And as I opened up the door, I just looked at my little boy, and he was in this huge pine bunk bed. And I looked at him, and he just looked so little to me. And as I kept looking at him, I realized how much I loved my son, and I felt this love for him. And I sat at the end of his bed, and I just took my finger and I touched those little heart-shaped lips. You know, when they sleep and their lips are like little hearts. And I just remember touching his lips. And he smelled the alcohol on me. And he opened up his eyes, and he asked me the question that every therapist, my mother, my sponsors, my husband had asked me. And he just said, "Mommy, why are you doing this to us?" And in that instant, I became willing to do whatever it took. I never wanted to drink alcohol again. And I hit my son's floor that night, and this is not some BS esoteric story from the podium. I grabbed my arms and I said a prayer that I believe every alcoholic needs to say for themselves, not their sponsor, not their therapist, not their husband, not for their kids, for themselves. And I just said, "God, please help me." And for me, it really was like a megaphone from the heavens. I heard something in Alex's room that night that I must have heard the 5 months that I came flitting in and out of here with my low-cut tops and my high-cut shorts, flirting with you men. Rarely do we see a person fail who thoroughly follows our path. And I knew I could do it. You had responsibly carried the message of Alcoholics Anonymous the 5 months that I came in and out of here. You carried the message to a drunken mother, because I was filled with a hope that night in my son's room that has never, ever left me from that night until today. And I knew I could do it. I knew I could have the hope that you people shared. And I knew it was not those foster homes, and it was not my father, and it was not the childhood. Everything that had ever spun down in my life surrounded that liquid called alcohol. It was over a liquid that looked no more or less innocuous than the water in this bottle, was so powerful over my mind. It was more powerful than a love a mother had for her own 2 children. And I will never be proud to share that. Anyway, I went and I slept in the back of my home group that night. And here I am, a surgeon's wife with a full-time maid, 4 cars in the garage paid for, a 5-bedroom house, and I'm sleeping in a van in the back of my home group. There was a guy that had a broken down van that used to let people stay coming off a drunk that had no money to find a place to stay. And I don't think I ever felt more at peace than I did that night, because I was not going to quit drinking. I was finished. I never wanted to drink alcohol again. I walked out of the van the next morning, and I found that mean old timer, Cowboy Nick, that used to tell the guys he sponsored, "Stay the hell away from that blonde girl, Tami. She's bad news." And I found Nick, and he saw me with puke in my hair, and I reeked of alcohol. And I said, "Nick, I just lost my kids. Please help me stop drinking." And he said, "Welcome home, kid." And he gave me a hug, and I haven't had a drink since. And that day with Nick at that coffee counter in my clubhouse, I surrendered my right to drink alcohol to God, to Nick, and to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. 365 days after I crawled out of that van, my home group started to sing Happy Birthday to me. And in that 365 days, I learned how to quit cussing from your podiums. I learned how to dress like a lady. I learned how to sit down in a meeting and not flaunt myself all around in front of you men. And as they sang Happy Birthday to me, I walked in the front of the room, and holding my cake was my husband, Rick, who had just celebrated, a year in Al-Anon. He was a little bit ahead of me, but only like 6 months. And they sang Happy Birthday to me, and he held up that cake, and On the other side of that one candle was my daughter Chelsea with a little dress, and her hair had been done by me, her mom. And I took in a deep breath and I blew out that candle, and I knew there was a God that day. His amazing grace. I went 365 days without a drink of alcohol. You know, you guys told me that great events would not only come to pass for me, but for countless others. At 12 years of, actually at 8, when I had 8 years of sobriety, my husband quit going to Al-Anon meetings. And he said, look, Tami, you know, I had gone back to school by then, and I had become a teacher. And remember, I lost custody of my own 2 children. And I was able to go back and get a bachelor's degree and a teaching credential. And I teach your kids, I teach your grandkids. That should scare you. And, you know, and we had a stable, peaceful home, and my husband quit going to Al-Anon meetings when I had 8 years of sobriety. When I had 12 years of sobriety, he came home and he said, Tami, I'm leaving you for another woman. She's younger than you, she's prettier than you, and she's more fun than you. And I know nobody ever believes this, but it turned out that she was actually a worse alcoholic than I was. And I thought I was going to die. And that beautiful little boy, Alex, that grew up in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, fell so hard to an addiction that after 2 outpatient programs and 2 inpatient programs, I had to have him sent away for 9 months to go live in Arizona to try to separate him from the drugs that were killing him. And a month after that, my old-timer Nick, who mentored me for the first 12 years of my sobriety, passed away with a stroke. So at 12 years of sobriety, I lost my 3 best guys, my husband, my son, and my old-timer. And I wish I could tell you all that being a good AA that I was and having the foundation and the mentors that I had, I just dove deeper into my meetings and deeper into service with others. I went upstairs, turned the heating blanket on up to mom, sucked my thumb, and thought of ways to kill myself at 12 years of sobriety. And all my newcomer babies would say, you know, you were a good wife, and you're a good AA, and you're a good mother. Pour you another drink. And then came the old-timers. And this time it was my current husband, Patrick. And he came in and he said, Tami, he said, you know what, your problem is not your, drug-addicted son. There are many of us in Alcoholics Anonymous that have had to raise drug-addicted children. And your problem is not your cheating husband. You are not the first, nor will you be the last woman to be walked out on an Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, your problem is not your dead sponsor. Many of us have had to bury beloved sponsors. Your problem is alcoholism, selfishness, self-centeredness. The world is revolving around you and your pain. Now get up out of this bed, quit sucking your thumb, and act like the sober woman and wife that we taught you to be. And I fell in love. And Patrick and I are a boy meets girl on AA campus. In fact, he just celebrated 30 years of sobriety. And I always ask him, yeah. And I always ask him, I said, you are such a flirt. When I came in, he had 12 years of sobriety. And I said, you were such a flirt, but you would never pay attention to me. And he says, man, you were a mess. He goes, you scared me. Anyway, 3 years ago, Patrick and my ex-husband, who, by the way, when we were going through that divorce, there was a lot of property and a lot of money, and it just was getting ugly. And I went to my old-timers in Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, you know what, there's attorneys, there's court dates, and this whole thing is so overwhelming. And they said, Tami, you can do whatever you want, but in Alcoholics Anonymous, we do things spiritually. Alimony is about, or spousal support is about putting someone back on their feet again. And they said, woman, he stood by your drunkenness. He stood by you in sobriety. He put you through a master's degree. He's put you back on your feet. So why don't you just ask him what he wants and walk away clean? And I went to him and he said, Tami, I'm a doctor. I went to medical school. My whole life is just my practice. He said, you're all about the kids in the home. Why don't you take the home and I'll take my practice and we'll share the kids. And we called off all the attorneys and actually settled our entire divorce out of court. And I'm so grateful to the old-timers for that. Yeah. Believe it or not, Rick lives in Fresno, and he comes down and he stays with Patrick and I for 2 weeks over Christmas. And 3 years ago, my daughter, that little girl that I lost custody of, Patrick and Rick and I were standing at UCLA. And Rick and Patrick were standing on 2 chairs, and they started to sing Pomp and Circumstance. And all of a sudden, this beautiful little girl walks with her graduating class with a little honors band, and it was my daughter Chelsea. And she's walking toward me, and I looked at her, and my daughter isn't covered in tattoos. My daughter doesn't cuss like a drunken sailor. She is an intelligent, articulate, beautiful young woman. And as she started to walk toward us, I looked up, and Patrick and my ex-husband have their hands in the air, and they're calling my daughter's name. And you know what? You were right. Great events did not only come to pass for me, but it came to pass for my children. And this is the great fact for us. And now I understand why you told me to quit cussing and quit acting the way I did, because I was raising a little girl. And I'm so grateful to you for that, because she's beautiful. My son kept struggling, and I want to let you know that 2 years ago I had to surrender and go to the enemy camp. And I found myself in Al-Anon. And you know, and thank God for my sponsor, because she said, Tami, you know, you're a pretty well-known speaker in the area that we're in. And she says, and I don't want you to go into Al-Anon as a sober alcoholic. She said, go in there and tell them you're a broken mother with a broken heart and a broken child. And I walked in the door, and they all recognized me, and I just took my sponsor's advice. And she goes, Tami, you're not a double winner. You're a brand newcomer in Al-Anon. And those women in Al-Anon let me be a newcomer, and they helped me through that. And my son is still struggling, but I'm okay. And I'm deeply indebted to Al-Anon for that. And, you know, in the end, I want to share that 2 weeks ago, I ended up walking Cal State University Northridge, and when I used to take 17 units, I'd come bragging to the old-timers, I'm back in school again, and I'm taking 17 units, and they'd say, good kid, now go drop 11 of them, because they said, you're not doing it that way, and if you do not participate regularly in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, you're not going to have any units, girl. And I have, at 18 years of sobriety, I walked Cal State Northridge, and I just 3 weeks ago received my master's degree in English. And that's not a victory for me, because left to my own devices, I puke in a porcelain bowl. But I'm just amazed at what you people have done with my life. Today, when I feel that fear that they talk about in this book, Alcoholics Anonymous, I have a mighty, powerful God that I pray to for strength. I have friends, a host of friends in Alcoholics Anonymous, and now here in Maui that I can come and just talk those dumb fears through with. I thank God for Alcoholics Anonymous. More importantly, I thank each and every one of you in Alcoholics Anonymous for God. Thanks for listening.